And welcome back to The Watchman from Paris. Not a bad view. Well, France has the largest Jewish population in all of Europe. At the same time, France has the largest Muslim population on this continent. Some 10% of the French population today is Islamic. Unfortunately, a good deal of the rising anti-Semitism in this country is coming from Islamic extremists here in France. We talked to one of France's foremost experts on anti-Semitism, Dr. Glenn Fetter, about the situation, the precarious situation for the Jewish people right here in Paris and beyond. Take a look. Number one, tell us about the trend recently of French Jews and a large Jewish population here, largest Jewish population in all of Europe here in France, but we see more and more Jews immigrating to Israel. Tell us why that's happening.
One of the main reasons is a security reason. If you want to be a Jew in France and you want to completely assimilate, don't wear a kippah on your head, don't talk about Israel, might be okay. But if you want to identify yourself as a Jew, as either a religious Jew or a Zionist Jew, then your chances of having an issue, whether it's a verbal attack or a violent attack, goes up dramatically. Last year, the incidents went down a little bit, but in the rate of aliyah, or Jews moving to Israel, went down a little bit. But in 2015, there were 7,000 French Jews that left to move to Israel.
And that's a big number considering the proportionate to the population, the Jewish population here in France.
The Jewish population is a little less than 500,000, so that's an enormous amount. If that trend continued within 15, 20 years, there won't really be very many Jews left in France. And it's the largest today, it's the largest community in Europe.
Yeah, and an historic Jewish community here, right, Glenn, that goes back centuries and centuries, the Jewish presence here in France. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, but the Jews have been here since the Middle Ages. If you want to divide it into, let's say, 3 waves, you have the Middle Ages, where Jews were persecuted as a religion. You have World War II, where they were persecuted as a people or ethnicity, and now you could arguably say that the 3rd wave is coming or already here, where Jews, I believe, for the most part, are being persecuted as a nation, because most of the anti-Semitism is coming in the form of anti-Israel propaganda.
You've been based here in Paris for 10 years, long stretch here. You're American-born, obviously. I want you to talk a little bit more, if you can, about daily life for the Jewish people here in France and some of that harassment. You mentioned, look, they can't wear a kippah, they can't wear maybe a prayer shawl on the streets. Talk a little bit more about the day-to-day, how Jews have been harassed here in France.
Sure. Well, a lot of it is that kind of what I call the passive harassment, where you just have there's a pressure to avoid your Judaism. Now, there is also active harassment, and there are flare-ups. A lot of them are linked directly with things happening in the Middle East. For example, when there's a flare-up in the Israeli-Arab conflict, you have a kind of domino effect in France.
It becomes more intense here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember in 2014, if you want to really get personal, I remember sitting at home and there was a flare-up. It was Operation Protective Shield, where Israel was defending themselves against terrorists in Gaza. Yeah. And there were riots of largely young Muslim men that were just roving around Sarcelles in some of the northern suburbs and attacking Jewish shops, synagogues. And I was on social media, and a lot of my friends, they were kind of following it. And at one point, Eric, I actually contemplated taking the mezuzah off my door. I never thought that I would actually have to do something like that in the 21st century, to actually take the mezuzah, which is really a sacred symbol.
Of course, ancient sacred symbol of the Jewish people. Every Jewish person, obviously, on the door frame outside the door of their home, puts a mezuzah. You see that in Jewish communities around the world. But Glenn, this is stunning to me, and I'm sure our audience, that this was 2014. You're living in Paris, one of the great cities of the West, yet you have to conceal your Jewish identity, and we're in 2017?
And the irony is that really France was the first country where Jews were emancipated. It was the first country, it was one of the founders of the notion of rights, of human rights, and one of the leaders of the Enlightenment. And so the irony of having to do something like that, it really struck me.
We've had this rise in Islamic terror here in France, but at the same time, usually that's accompanied by a rise in anti-Semitism. Talk about that link. Look, it's undeniable that much of this anti-Semitism is being driven by radical Islamists. Not all Muslims, obviously, in France, but there is a vocal faction of radicals here who are pushing some of that anti-Semitic activity.
Sure. I mean, even if you have less than 1% of 10% being radicalized, 10% of millions of people is a very high number. This is going to make, I think, it very difficult to raise a family in France and really have a very happy future.
Yeah, for the Jewish people, it's a sad thing, Glenn. It's the most ancient poison, right? Anti-Semitism rearing its head here in a major way. But thank God we have you on the front line sounding the alarm about it. Glenn, thanks so much for letting us join you here in the beautiful city of Paris. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you for all your great work as well, Eric.
You too, Glenn. We appreciate it, my friend.
Up next, with anti-Semitism rising in Europe, we look back at an earlier wave of violence against the ancient Jewish community of Iraq and how one man lived to tell the story. Don't move.